I think we've all had that problem of painting a landscape in the studio from a photograph, of looking at the painting when we're done and just thinking it looks kind of dead, looks kind of blah. There's no interest in it. So I want to talk about how to take photographs that we're painting in the studio and make them more interesting. For outside painting, we're looking at real color, seeing real values, and it's more spontaneous. We're responding to what we see. There's more excitement in the painting just because we're looking at real stuff. Photographs can be dead. The colors are more photographic looking. Values are usually not as strong. So what do we do with the photographs in the studio? How can we make the painting a bit more exciting or more interesting to the viewer? So I have four things here. The first one is to simplify. The camera sees way too much. It sees all the detail and crams it all into a little photograph. Number two is to take those simple shapes that we've simplified and compose a good composition. Number three is to get good value contrast between those big shapes. And number four would be color, where to place more saturated color, saturated being stronger color, more intense, and where to place the more muted, less saturated color. So let's get started here with some photographs. This was from a recent trip I made to Colorado, and it was cloudy. Rained a lot, wasn't a lot of sunlight. So what do I do with these photographs? And looking first at it to try and simplify it, I think it has big, simple shapes. I've got about 4 or 5 big shapes here, so I think that works good. I got one shape for the sky, 2 shape for the mountains, 3 for the trees, and then 4 for the flat plane in there. And that's 4 basic shapes. And I think they're arranged in a good composition. I want to do something with this variety of color in the green here to maybe turn it this way and pull the viewer's eye back into the composition. Here you follow this kind of weak looking line and it just leads you right off the composition. So then color-wise, where do I want to punch the color? The color's kind of all the same. It has some lighter color, some darker color and values, but nothing jumps out. So first thing I want to do is create a bit more contrast between the big shapes. And I'm going to do that by throwing the foreground into shadow. And right away, I get more contrast here. In the lights, this looks a lot lighter, and I've made this a lot darker. So right away, I've created more contrast between the shapes there. I also want to get rid of the green way in the background and the value in there. I want to push some more value contrast in the mountains and push a cooler color to make these mountains back there recede and go back. So finally, what I'm doing here, more violet in the mountains back in here, some violet in the shadows, because I want to push these trees. These are aspens. Here the aspens are green. This is in August, so the aspens are green, but I'm pushing them yellow. So I'm moving this ahead from late August to probably late September. And to accentuate the yellow color, I'm pushing the mountains more violet and adding some violet to the shadows of the distant pine trees. And that's going to give me more complementary color contrast. The yellow and the violet looks a lot stronger. It creates more interest color-wise. Plus, I'm adding some sunlight, obviously, to the tops of the trees by throwing the cast shadow from a cloud in front and the sunlight hitting back here and along the tops of the aspens. So it's real important that I create a shape on top of the aspens that is interesting. I can't just slap some bright yellow on top of this shape. I have to think about how that shape is going to look. And I'm not thinking individual trees. I'm thinking this as one big shape, all of these aspens. So the light is a big shape that connects. and I'm not drawing individual trees. Now, the minute I add a few tree trunks, they look like individual trees, but I'm thinking big shape, big value, and trying to push the contrast as much as possible. Then I'm pushing the color back in here a little bit stronger. See in the photograph, this looks pretty bright. The sun's not real direct. It's still kind of cloudy, but pushing it a bit more, some stronger yellow-green to really contrast the blue-green of the shadow I created there. So pushing the value contrast, pushing the temperature contrast, warm and cool, and also the complementary color contrast, the yellow, and adding some violets in some of the darks, as well as some violet here kind of in the foreground. Then in the foreground grass, I've taken some of these colors. There's a variety of color in the grass there. And I've created shape or pattern of this kind of lighter yellow grass that kind of leads back in there to create some interest, to pull the viewer's eye in there. So you can see the value contrast by throwing the foreground in shadow and adding a little bit of sunlight in the middle ground and on the aspens really creates a lot more interest right away. Now, I don't have to change the color. I could use the color that's in the photograph, but the color's not that great. What matters is how the values relate within the painting. The color is just going to be a choice. So keeping things simple, creating more contrast, using a variety of intense colors in the yellows and in the yellow greens, and then the more muted colors in the shadows. So trying to work that together to create more interest in that image. Next one here, same area, same cloudy day actually. And I like the interest here. I like the shapes. It has, again, big simple shapes. You got the shape of the sky, shape of the mountains, shape of the trees, and shape of the flat plain and the water. So I got 4 or 5 big shapes there. Now, how do I arrange them? In this photograph, I've really pulled back. It's really a big view. I could zoom in a bit more and create a more interesting view. I don't need as much sky as I have in the photograph. I also don't need as much on the side. All this stuff on the side, a quarter of the photograph, is really not necessary. My interest is kind of right in here, the peak where the water starts to turn, the hills here, the variety of shapes on the grass, the trees, and all that really creates an interest there. Same thing on this side. I really don't need that much over there. So zooming in creates a better composition. I also don't need that much sky, so I'm going to lift it up, have more water and less sky. What I don't want compositionally is half and half, like that. Then the horizontal line is too close to center, which is kind of static. It looks kind of boring. So make a decision. Do I want more sky and less water, which would work, but I think the water is more interesting. So less sky, more water, and that raises the horizontal line up pretty high. It's not centered now. But let's go back to the full photograph just to talk about value and color changes here, how to create more contrast and where to put stronger color and more muted color. So first thing here is to create contrast between the big shapes. So using some blue, blue-green, blue-violet, I'm throwing the foreground in shadow again, and also the background mountains with a little bit of sunlight right in here. And you can see everything's somewhat the same. There's some value change in the photograph, some color change, but it's somewhat dead. So pushing the darks a little cooler, more yellow-green where the sun is hitting back in there, creates more interest, sense of sunlight. Not that every painting has to have direct sunlight in it. There's nothing wrong with painting cloudy days, but I don't think this photograph has what I need value-wise or color-wise. So I'm putting in big areas of dark to contrast where I want the lighter, brighter colors to be. Then I'm going to throw the water more in violet. Again, color there, it's a little on the dead side. Color is a choice pretty much. As long as I make it the right value and the right temperature, it's going to work. And let's zoom in a little bit more. But I would crop it and kind of zoom in a little bit. But this gives me a little more of what I'm looking for compositionally. And I'm going to cut off and having more water and less sky. Anyway, see this as bigger shapes. I've got this foreground shadow. And in that foreground shadow, I've got a darker shadow on the grass and a little bit lighter in the water. So I got two shapes there. I got the sunlit grass and pine trees in the middle ground and this hill. That's all in the middle ground there with the dark pattern as well. So simplifying it by not having much detail, just simple dark and light on the trees, on the ground, on the hill. Then the background mountains are all in shadow, and I'm forcing them bluer. Maybe a little bit of red violet in there, but bluer, blue, blue-green, blue-violet. And then simplify the sky into two values, a light and a dark here, a dark shape that kind of gives it a little bit more interesting shape than what the photograph has. So you can see the contrast, creating a darker dark here in front, more light in the middle ground, creates that contrast in there. Same thing with the hills in the background. Darker shadow, cloud shadow over the mountains, more sunlight on that hill. And it's not something that difficult to think about. Just think about where shadows, cloud shadows, would fall on the mountains and where you want the sunlight to break through and hit it. And it just creates more contrast, value contrast, temperature contrast between the lighter, warmer color and darker, cooler color as well. One more here, same area. Here we're getting some more sunlight. So right away you can see more of the foreground and shadow, a little bit of sunlight here in the middle ground. Then shadow and sunlight kind of rolling through these hills nicely. So I want to simplify that and create more contrast between those areas. So I'm going to use what I have in the photograph, but just create more contrast. I'm also going to move the water. You can see the water right here. It's a little thin stream. I'm going to move it out a little bit more so that that leads the eye into the composition more. So I'm using that for the composition. I've darkened the foreground more than what the photograph has. And I've also darkened the shadow back in here on the pine trees, the shadow here on the hillside, and then the shadows in the background. Just made all the shadows a bit darker. And then popped the light in the middle ground and the spots here where it shows through on the pine trees and the spots on the mountain. So I've got about 3 or 4 spots of strong contrast of sunlight. Color-wise, I don't care what's there. I mean, I'm thinking more yellow-green. And then I'm pushing that yellow-green different directions, subtle color change to create some variation. Because I don't want it all the same yellow-green. So some of it's orange, some of it's a bit more towards ochre or cad yellow, but somewhere around yellow-green, warmer colors. Slightly muted because they are far away. Same thing with the kind of red-orange here with the sunlight. I don't want much cad yellow back in here because it's just too far away. So it's more orange, muted with a little bit of blue. And having my stronger colors here because it's closer, and in the pine trees. This is where my interest is, kind of right here. So I'm going to have my strongest color there to create more interest. And then finally, I'm going to push it a bit more blues, violets, again, to separate the background from the foreground. Lighter, cooler color back in here in the mountains. Shadows are darker, not as cool in front. And then in the foreground, the shadows have a lot of warmth in it. So that shadows are gradually getting cooler as they go back. And pushing the sunlit areas warmer and lighter, pushing the shadows cooler. Difference here is taking the shapes that are already there and increasing the contrast, the value contrast, and then just adding color, keeping the colors cooler within the shadows, warmer within the sunlight. Broke up the sky a little bit with 2 values of blue. Top sky, or the blue sky near the top, is going to be a little darker, then it gets lighter as it recedes. And it just breaks up the clouds a bit more. A bit of interest in the sky, but I don't need too much interest in the sky. The interest is down here in the mountains and the hill. But more value contrast, punching a little bit stronger color in the lights, some in the shadows to create more interest, but not as strong as they are in the light areas. All right, now let's look at some paintings. Pulled up some paintings here by Hanson Puthoff, and let's look at how he's created more interest in the paintings by pushing the contrast, having nice, simple shapes. He's got the shape of the sky, shape of the mountain here, shape of the trees, and then shape of the flat plane. And he's broken up the flat plane. Your eye kind of follows the pattern of these light and dark grasses and path. It's got the strong contrast between the trees and the background hill. Here are the more saturated colors in the middle ground trees. That's the strongest color. It comes forward the most. But even in the background hill, that's fairly strong color. It's lighter and a bit cooler than here, so it stays back there, but there's a lot of nice strong color back in there. And you can have stronger color and warm color way in the distance, as long as it's not as strong and warm as the stuff more in the foreground or the middle ground. Another one here, again, big simple shapes. Got the shape of the sky, shape of the mountains, maybe 2 or 3 shapes there. Shape of the foreground, flat plane with the dirt and the grass. So you get about 5 or 6 shapes, simplified. Then you can focus on getting the contrast of the hill or the cliffs against the sky, the shadow on the hill against the sunlight on the ground. There's big shapes, they're simplified, and there's a lot of contrast between them. Even if this is a cloudy day, I still want a lot of contrast between these upright shapes of the cliffs and the cloudy sky. There's going to be a lot of contrast there. With the sunlight, there's just going to be more cast shadows with more value contrast and temperature contrast. But just because it's a cloudy day doesn't mean you're not going to have strong value contrast. Nice simple darks in the grass for the upright shrubbery, and dark enough that it draws your attention and it creates kind of a pattern that you can follow, leads you to the background a bit more. So nice one here, throwing the foreground in shadow, and the color very saturated up in here, even in the shadows, pretty strong color, and then gradually gets more muted as it recedes. But a lot of contrast between the big shapes. Sky shape, background mountain shape, middle ground mountain shape. Then you got this flat area in the middle ground and foreground, and then you got the trees over here. So again, 4, 5, 6 big masses, which makes it easier to create more value contrast between those shapes. If he doesn't get the contrast between this sunlit tree and the background mountain, that value contrast, how much darker the tree is than the mountain, then you're going to lose that depth and atmosphere. And a lot of strong saturated color in here, but there's also a lot of muted color, especially in the shadows, but even the light areas. There's some violet scrubbed into these warm colors that kind of tones some of the areas down a little bit. So not all the colors are screaming at you, but just a selected few. This one also looking into the sunlight. Again, big simple shapes. You got 5 or 6 big shapes here, and the strong contrast between the shapes in the foreground that are dark and the shapes in the background that are lighter. Even the shadows are a lot lighter in the background. And a lot of temperature contrast, a lot of just blue and yellow orange in this painting to create that sense of temperature contrast, to create the sense of light. Same thing here, that contrast of the tree shapes with the background mountain. Also, how much cooler background mountain is, and lighter and darker and warmer the foreground trees are. And then the yellow dirt or flat plane kind of pulls your eye back into the background. One more here. Again, simplified shapes, sky shape, mountain is broken up into about 3 shapes. Then you got forest shape of the water, and then the shape in the foreground here. And throwing that in shadow really creates a lot of contrast between the bigger shapes of the sunlit mountain and the snow. And if you're not aware of trying to push that, there won't be enough contrast. Really be aware of taking those big, simple shapes and seeing where you can push the contrast between them. And the color's fairly simple here, just warmer in the foreground and gradually getting cooler and a bit muted as it recedes. So again, the 4 keys are simplifying your subject to bigger, more simpler shapes, create a good composition with those shapes, make sure there's good, strong contrast between those simplified shapes, and then think through where you want your more saturated, stronger color and where you want the more desaturated or more muted color in your painting. And I hope that helps, and we'll see you next time.